Standing in that sterile courthouse hallway, I stared at the lawsuit papers with trembling hands. My own parents, who abandoned me when I was 4 years old, were suing me for $2.7 million. The inheritance my beloved grandfather left me, the man who raised me after they disappeared, was apparently theirs by right. 23 years of silence, and now they wanted everything. The irony was suffocating. They threw me away like garbage, but somehow felt entitled to the fortune that came with my name. Before we dive into this family betrayal that will leave you questioning everything about blood loyalty, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you have ever felt abandoned by family, and subscribe, because this story gets so much darker than you could imagine. Trust me, the revenge that unfolds will have you cheering by the end. My name is Isabella, and this nightmare began 3 weeks ago when a process server knocked on my apartment door in downtown Portland. I thought it was a mistake at first, some mix-up with addresses or names, but there it was, clear as day, Rebecca and Michael Torres versus Isabella Marie Torres, civil lawsuit for wrongful inheritance claim. The memory of that morning still makes my stomach turn. I had been preparing for my graduate school finals, my textbooks spread across the kitchen table of the cozy apartment I shared with my roommate Maya. The inheritance from Grandpa Joe had made this life possible. Not just the apartment, but my education, my sense of security, everything I had worked for since aging out of foster care at 18. You see, my parents disappeared when I was 4. Not died, not tragically taken. They simply vanished one Tuesday morning. I woke up to an empty house. Their belongings gone a note on the refrigerator that said they could not handle being parents anymore, and that someone would come for me soon. That someone never came. I survived on cereal and whatever I could reach in the kitchen for 3 days before Mrs. Patterson next door heard me crying and called social services. The social worker, a kind woman named Janet, explained that my parents had essentially surrendered their parental rights by abandonment. There was no forwarding address, no contact information, nothing. They had vanished completely from my life. Janet tried everything to track them down, but it was like they had never existed. I spent the next 2 years bouncing between foster homes until Grandpa Joe found me. I will never forget the day he walked into that sterile meeting room at the Department of Human Services. Tall, weathered hands, eyes that looked exactly like mine. He was my father's father, and he had been searching for me since the moment he learned what happened. Apparently, my parents had cut off all contact with him too, and it took him 2 years of private investigators and legal battles to locate me in the system. Grandpa Joe was a retired construction foreman who had saved every penny his entire life. He was not wealthy by most standards, but he owned his home outright and had a modest investment portfolio. More importantly, he had a heart bigger than the entire state of Oregon. He fought through mountains of paperwork, background checks, and court hearings to gain custody of me. When I finally moved into his small but warm house, I felt safe for the first time since my parents left. He raised me with discipline and love, teaching me the value of hard work, integrity, and education. When other kids were getting dropped off at school by parents in fancy cars, Grandpa Joe walked me to the bus stop every morning in his worn work boots, making sure I knew I was loved. He attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every graduation. He was more of a parent to me than my biological parents had ever been. Grandpa Joe passed away 2 years ago from lung cancer, a consequence of decades of construction work before safety regulations were properly enforced. In his final weeks, he made sure his will was ironclad. He left everything to me. His house, his savings, his investment accounts, everything. His lawyer, Mr. Henderson, explained that the total value was approximately $2.7 million, accumulated through a lifetime of careful saving and some surprisingly successful stock investments. But here is what made the lawsuit so particularly vicious. According to the legal documents I now held in my shaking hands, my parents claimed they never legally surrendered their parental rights. They argued that their abandonment was temporary, caused by mental health crises and financial stress. They claimed they had intended to return for me, but were prevented by circumstances beyond their control. The lawsuit detailed their current life with surgical precision. Rebecca Torres, now a real estate agent in Phoenix. Michael Torres, a small business owner, running a struggling auto repair shop. They had tracked down my inheritance through public probate records and decided that as my biological parents, they were entitled to claim what their father had left me. Reading their statement felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. They painted themselves as victims of circumstance. Young parents overwhelmed by responsibility who had made a terrible mistake, but never stopped loving their daughter. They claimed that Grandpa Joe had manipulated the legal system to steal me away from them and turn me against my own family. The most disgusting part was their claim that I was psychologically damaged by my abandonment and therefore not competent to manage such a large inheritance. They were literally arguing that they should control my money because they had traumatized me by leaving. I called Mr. Henderson immediately, my voice barely steady enough to explain what was happening. He listened carefully to every word, asked me to scan and email the documents, and scheduled an emergency meeting for the next day. His tone was calm, but I could hear the anger underneath when he told me this was one of the most shameless legal maneuvers he had encountered in 30 years of practice. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about 4-year-old me sitting on the kitchen floor eating dry cereal, wondering when Mommy and Daddy would come home. I thought about all the nights Grandpa Joe sat by my bed, when I had nightmares, all the times he held me when I cried about feeling unwanted. And now these people, strangers who happened to share my DNA, wanted to profit from the love and sacrifice of the man who actually raised me. Maya found me crying in the kitchen at 3 a.m, surrounded by old photo albums. Pictures of Grandpa Joe teaching me to ride a bike, helping with homework, proudly holding my high school diploma. In not a single photograph did my biological parents appear, because they had chosen to erase themselves from my life. The next morning brought another shock. Mr. Henderson called to inform me that my parents had hired an aggressive litigation firm known for taking on inheritance disputes. They were serious about this lawsuit, and they had done their homework. They knew exactly how much money was involved, and they wanted every penny. The meeting with Mr. Henderson changed everything about how I understood this situation. Sitting in his office, surrounded by law books and the scent of old leather, he laid out the brutal reality of what I was facing. My parents were not just making a desperate grab for money. They had crafted a sophisticated legal strategy designed to exploit every possible weakness in my position. Henderson pulled out a thick folder and began explaining the angles of their attack. First, they were challenging the validity of the abandonment proceedings from 23 years ago. Their lawyer had discovered that the original social worker, Janet, had retired, and several key documents from my case file were missing or incomplete. They were arguing that proper procedures had not been followed when my parents were declared to have surrendered their rights. Second, they were claiming that Grandpa Joe had engaged in parental alienation, systematically turning me against them and preventing any possibility of reconciliation. They had submitted affidavits claiming they had attempted to contact me multiple times over the years, but that Grandpa Joe had blocked their efforts. This was a complete fabrication, but proving it would require evidence I was not sure existed. The most calculated part of their strategy involved questioning my mental competency. They had hired a forensic psychologist who specialized in childhood abandonment trauma. Their expert was prepared to testify that people who experience severe abandonment at such a young age often develop attachment disorders that impair their judgment, especially regarding financial decisions. They wanted the court to declare me psychologically unfit to manage the inheritance and appoint them as financial guardians. Henderson paused after explaining this last point, watching my reaction carefully. The implications were staggering. Not only did they want my money, they wanted legal control over my life. They were essentially arguing that their act of abandoning me had damaged me so severely that they should now be put in charge of my affairs. But Henderson was not finished. He opened another section of the folder and showed me something that made my blood run cold. They had been watching me. For months, maybe longer. The lawsuit included detailed information about my daily routines, my graduate school program, my part-time job at a local bookstore, even my relationship with my boyfriend David. They knew where I lived, where I studied, where I worked. The private investigator they had hired had compiled a comprehensive dossier on my life. Photographs of me walking to class, copies of my academic records somehow obtained through questionable means, financial records showing exactly how I had been using the inheritance money. They had invaded my privacy completely while preparing their legal assault. Henderson leaned forward and spoke in a tone I had never heard from him before. This was not just a civil lawsuit. This was systematic harassment designed to intimidate me into settling. They were banking on the fact that I was young alone and emotionally vulnerable. They expected me to fold under pressure rather than fight. That afternoon, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. Instead of feeling sorry for myself or hiding from this attack, I was going to investigate them just as thoroughly as they had investigated me. If they wanted to play dirty, I would learn the rules of their game. I started with social media, something their generation clearly did not understand as well as mine. Within an hour of searching, I found Rebecca's Facebook profile, which she had somehow failed to set to private. Her timeline was a goldmine of incriminating information. Post after post showed a lifestyle that directly contradicted their claims of financial hardship. Expensive vacations to Hawaii, photos of a new luxury car, pictures from high-end restaurants and shopping trips. But the real breakthrough came when I found Michael's business Facebook page for Torres Auto Repair. His posts revealed a successful operation with multiple employees and a constant stream of satisfied customers. The financial distress they claimed in their lawsuit was clearly exaggerated, if not completely fabricated. Even more revealing were the comments and interactions on their posts. Friends and family members regularly mentioned how well they were doing, congratulating them on business success and their beautiful home in Scottsdale. These were not people struggling to make ends meet. These were people living comfortably while lying to a court about their circumstances. I screenshot everything, organizing the evidence methodically. But I needed more than social media posts to expose the full scope of their deception. That evening, I called my college friend Marcus, who worked in digital forensics for a cybersecurity company. I explained the situation and asked if he could help me gather more comprehensive information about my parents' actual financial situation. Marcus was outraged when I told him the story. He had known me since freshman year and had watched me work multiple jobs to pay for school before the inheritance. The idea that my abandoning parents were now trying to steal the money that my grandfather had left me personally offended him. He agreed to help, but warned me that everything had to be completely legal and ethical. Over the next week, Marcus taught me how to research public records, business filings, property ownership documents, and tax liens. What we discovered was astounding. Not only were my parents financially stable, they were significantly wealthier than they had claimed in their lawsuit. Michael's auto repair business was actually a franchise operation with 3 locations across Phoenix. Property records showed they owned their home outright, plus 2 rental properties that generated additional income. Rebecca's real estate career was equally successful. She was consistently one of the top performers in her agency, with sales records showing commissions well into the 6-figure range annually. But the most damaging discovery came when Marcus found bankruptcy records from 8 years earlier. My parents had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, claiming overwhelming debt and business failure. However, the timeline was suspicious. They had transferred significant assets to family members just months before filing, then bought them back for nominal fees after the bankruptcy was discharged. This pattern suggested deliberate fraud gaming the bankruptcy system to eliminate legitimate debts while protecting their wealth. Armed with this information, I scheduled another meeting with Henderson. When I walked into his office with printed copies of everything I had discovered, his expression changed from concerned sympathy to something much more predatory. He was no longer just defending me. He was preparing to go on the offensive. Henderson studied the documents for over an hour, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. Finally, he looked up with a smile that reminded me why he had never lost an inheritance dispute in his entire career. The game had changed completely. My parents had made a critical error by lying about their financial situation in their lawsuit. Not only could we prove they were not entitled to my inheritance, we could potentially expose them to criminal charges for fraud and perjury. They had overplayed their hand, and now they were about to discover exactly what kind of mistake they had made. The next phase of this battle required building a team of people who understood exactly what my parents had done and were willing to help me fight back. Henderson introduced me to Sarah Martinez, a forensic accountant who specialized in exposing hidden assets and financial fraud. When she reviewed the evidence Marcus and I had compiled, her reaction was immediate and decisive. Sarah explained that my parents had constructed what she called a house of cards, multiple layers of financial deception that looked sophisticated on the surface, but would collapse under scrutiny. The bankruptcy fraud alone was enough to trigger a federal investigation, but there were additional irregularities that suggested a pattern of systematic dishonesty spanning years. For instance, the rental properties they owned were listed under a shell company that Michael had created presumably to hide assets from creditors and tax authorities. Rebecca's real estate commissions were being funneled through a separate business entity that claimed to provide marketing services, reducing her apparent income for tax purposes. They had built an elaborate system designed to make them appear less wealthy than they actually were. But Sarah's most significant discovery involved the timing of their lawsuit against me. They had filed their claim exactly 3 days after the statute of limitations would have expired for challenging Grandpa Joe's will. This suggested that they had been monitoring the probate proceedings all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had known about my inheritance from the beginning, but had delayed their legal action for strategic reasons. This revelation fundamentally changed how we understood their motivations. They were not desperate parents trying to reconnect with a lost daughter. They were calculating opportunists who had been planning this financial assault for 2 years. The emotional manipulation in their legal filings was pure theater, designed to gain sympathy from a judge while they attempted to steal money they had no legitimate claim to. Henderson suggested we needed character witnesses who could testify about my relationship with Grandpa Joe and the circumstances of my abandonment. I reached out to Mrs. Patterson, my childhood neighbor who had discovered me alone in that empty house 23 years ago. Now in her 70s, she still lived in the same house and remembered every detail of that terrible week. Mrs. Patterson was furious when I explained what my parents were attempting. She had watched Grandpa Joe's search for me, had seen his dedication during those early custody proceedings, and had observed our relationship throughout my childhood and teenage years. She eagerly agreed to provide testimony about both my abandonment and the loving home Grandpa Joe had created for me. I also contacted Janet, the social worker who had handled my case. Although she was retired, she maintained detailed personal records of the children she had helped over the decades. Janet remembered me clearly and was appalled by my parents' revisionist version of events. She confirmed that my parents had never attempted to contact social services after abandoning me, had never responded to multiple attempts to locate them, and had legally forfeited their parental rights through their actions. But the most powerful ally emerged from an unexpected source. David, my boyfriend of 2 years, worked as a junior reporter for the Portland Tribune. When I finally told him the full story of what was happening, his journalistic instincts immediately recognized the public interest angle. A story about parents abandoning their child, then suing for inheritance money 23 years later, was exactly the kind of human interest piece that resonated with readers. David offered to investigate the story professionally, which would give us access to resources and databases that private citizens could not reach. More importantly, public exposure of their scheme would make it much more difficult for my parents to maintain their facade of victimhood. Henderson approved the idea, noting that media attention often encouraged people with additional information to come forward. David's investigation uncovered details that even Marcus's digital forensics had missed. Through public records requests and interviews with former business associates, David discovered that my parents had a history of questionable financial dealings dating back to before I was born. Multiple former business partners had accused Michael of fraudulent practices, and Rebecca had been investigated by her real estate licensing board for misrepresenting property conditions to buyers. Even more damaging was David's discovery that they had attempted a similar inheritance scheme with other family members. Michael's aunt had died 5 years earlier, leaving a modest inheritance to her children. My parents had filed a lawsuit claiming that Michael was entitled to a portion of the estate based on a verbal promise from his aunt. The case was eventually dismissed, but the pattern of behavior was clear. During this investigation, something unexpected happened that provided the emotional support I desperately needed. Maya, my roommate, organized what she called a chosen family meeting in our apartment. She invited David, Marcus, Mrs. Patterson, and even Mr. Henderson to dinner, creating a gathering of everyone who had rallied to support me during this crisis. Sitting around our small dining table sharing a meal with people who cared about me, not because of shared genetics, but because of genuine affection and respect, I realized something profound about the nature of family. These people had chosen to be in my life, had invested time and energy in my well-being, and were now sacrificing their own comfort to help me fight this battle. Mrs. Patterson shared stories about watching Grandpa Joe and me together, how he had taught me to garden in their adjacent backyard, how proud he was at every school achievement, how he had worried about my future and planned carefully to ensure I would be secure after his death. Her memories painted a picture of a grandfather who had not just provided for me financially, but had loved me unconditionally. Henderson revealed something he had not shared before. Grandpa Joe had consulted with him years earlier about the possibility of my biological parents returning to claim inheritance rights. They had structured his will specifically to prevent exactly the scenario I was now facing, including detailed documentation of the abandonment and provisions that would make any challenge extremely difficult to sustain. The dinner conversation shifted when David shared preliminary findings from his journalistic investigation. He had discovered that my parents were facing significant financial pressure despite their apparent wealth. Michael's auto repair business was being investigated by state authorities for insurance fraud, and Rebecca's real estate agency was being audited by the IRS for suspicious commission reporting. This explained the timing of their lawsuit with new clarity. They were not just greedy, they were desperate. Their elaborate financial shell game was collapsing, and they needed a large influx of cash to avoid criminal prosecution and business failure. My inheritance represented a potential solution to problems they had created through their own dishonest behavior. Marcus had been quietly working on additional digital investigation during dinner preparation. He announced that he had found evidence of my parents attempting to contact other potential targets. They had reached out to several of Grandpa Joe's former co-workers, claiming to be his son and daughter-in-law, and asking about any savings or benefits that might have been left unclaimed. This suggested they were running multiple inheritance scams simultaneously. As the evening concluded, Henderson outlined our revised legal strategy. Instead of simply defending against their lawsuit, We were going to file counterclaims for fraud, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We would expose their financial deception publicly, provide evidence of their pattern of dishonest behavior, and seek damages for the trauma they had caused me through their legal assault. But Henderson warned that the next phase would be intense and potentially dangerous. Desperate people facing exposure often escalate their behavior unpredictably. We needed to be prepared for them to fight even more viciously as their scheme unraveled. However, with the evidence we had compiled and the support team we had assembled, he was confident we would not just survive their attack. We would completely destroy their credibility and ensure they faced consequences for their actions. The battle was about to reach its climax, and I finally felt ready for whatever they threw at me next. The deposition hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late March, and I knew this would be the moment everything came crashing down for my parents. Henderson had orchestrated this, carefully timing the release of our evidence to coincide with David's newspaper article, which was set to publish the same day. The coordination was deliberate. We wanted maximum impact when their lies were exposed publicly. I arrived at the courthouse with my entire support team. Henderson carried 3 briefcases full of documentation. Sarah Martinez had her forensic analysis ready, and David brought recording equipment to capture whatever happened for his follow-up story. Mrs. Patterson sat in the gallery, her presence a powerful reminder of the truth about my abandonment. My parents walked in with their legal team, looking confident and composed. Rebecca wore an expensive designer suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, while claiming financial hardship in legal documents. Michael carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed he was about to score a major financial victory. Neither of them looked at me directly, maintaining the pretense that this was about justice rather than greed. Their lawyer, a slick character named Thompson, who specialized in questionable inheritance challenges, opened with the same emotional manipulation they had been using throughout this process. He painted a picture of young parents overwhelmed by circumstances, forced to make an impossible decision, who had spent decades regretting their mistake and hoping for reconciliation with their beloved daughter. But Henderson was ready. When it came time for our response, he did not begin with legal arguments or procedural challenges. Instead, he started with a simple question directed at Rebecca. "Mrs. Torres, can you explain to the court why your social media posts from last month show you celebrating a luxury vacation in Maui if you are experiencing the financial distress described in your lawsuit?" The color drained from Rebecca's face instantly. Thompson objected, claiming the question was irrelevant, but the judge overruled him. Social media evidence was perfectly admissible, and the contradiction between their claims and their lifestyle was directly relevant to their credibility. Henderson methodically walked through the evidence we had compiled. Bank records showing substantial assets, property ownership documents revealing hidden real estate investments, business filings that contradicted their claimed income levels. With each piece of evidence, the facade crumbled further. But the truly devastating moment came when Henderson introduced evidence of the bankruptcy fraud. Sarah Martinez took the stand as an expert witness and explained in clinical detail how my parents had systematically hidden assets before filing for bankruptcy, then recovered those assets afterward through fraudulent transfers. The pattern was clear, documented, and illegal. Michael's composure finally broke when Henderson presented evidence of his insurance fraud investigation. Apparently, his auto repair business had been billing insurance companies for work never performed, using fake invoices and manufactured damage reports. The state investigation was further along than anyone had realized, and criminal charges were likely within weeks. The most dramatic moment occurred when Henderson called Mrs. Patterson to testify. This elderly woman who had discovered me abandoned and alone 23 years earlier looked directly at my parents and described finding a 4-year-old child surviving on cereal and tap water, waiting for parents who had simply vanished. Her voice shook with emotion as she recounted those 3 days of abandonment. But her testimony was devastating in its clarity. Thompson attempted to discredit Mrs. Patterson by suggesting her memory was unreliable due to her age, but this strategy backfired spectacularly. She produced a detailed diary she had kept throughout that period with daily entries describing her concerns about the empty house next door and her eventual decision to call social services. The documentation was contemporaneous and irrefutable. When David's newspaper article hit online during the lunch break, the courthouse atmosphere changed completely. The story had gone viral within hours, with thousands of comments from readers expressing outrage at my parents' behavior. The headline read, "Parent sue daughter for millions after abandoning her as toddler," and the public response was overwhelmingly supportive of my position. The afternoon session focused on the most damaging evidence of all: proof that my parents had been monitoring my inheritance from the moment Grandpa Joe died. Henderson presented email records obtained through legal discovery, showing that Rebecca had been in contact with a probate research company that specialized in locating unclaimed inheritances. They had been tracking my grandfather's estate proceedings for 2 years, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Even worse, these emails revealed that they had discussed my psychological state and vulnerability, strategizing about how to present their case to maximize the chances of success. They had coldly calculated that portraying me as mentally damaged by abandonment would garner sympathy from a judge while justifying their claim to financial guardianship. Thompson made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation by arguing that his client's current financial status was irrelevant to their parental rights and inheritance claims. But Henderson was prepared for this argument too. He presented evidence that my parents had attempted similar schemes with other family members, establishing a pattern of predatory behavior that had nothing to do with parental love or reconciliation. The final blow came when Henderson revealed that my parents had hired a private investigator, not just to research my current life, but to look for ways to discredit my relationship with Grandpa Joe. They had attempted to find evidence that he had been an unfit guardian, hoping to argue that his custody of me had been illegitimate. The investigation had found nothing because there was nothing to find, but the attempt revealed their true motivations. By late afternoon, Thompson was essentially arguing damage control rather than victory. He requested a recess to consult with his clients, but the judge denied the request. The evidence was overwhelming. The contradictions in their testimony were glaring, and their credibility had been completely destroyed. When the judge asked if my parents had anything to add before he rendered his decision, Michael finally spoke. Instead of showing remorse or acknowledging the pain they had caused, he launched into a bitter tirade about how Grandpa Joe had poisoned me against them and stolen what should have been their inheritance. His words revealed exactly the kind of person he was, someone who felt entitled to money he had never earned from a man who had raised the child he abandoned. Rebecca's response was even worse. She claimed that I had been manipulated into believing lies about my childhood and that everything we had presented was part of an elaborate conspiracy to deny them their rightful place in my life. She actually suggested that Grandpa Joe had brainwashed me against my own parents, despite the documented fact that I was 4 years old when they disappeared. The judge's decision was swift and comprehensive. Not only did he dismiss their lawsuit entirely, he imposed sanctions for filing frivolous claims and awarded attorney fees to our side. More significantly, he referred the matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential criminal fraud charges related to their false statements under oath. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, my parents' empire of lies had completely collapsed. But I knew this was only the beginning of their consequences. The 24 hours following the deposition hearing brought a cascade of consequences that even Henderson had not anticipated. The viral nature of David's article had attracted attention from investigative journalists, law enforcement agencies, and other potential victims of my parents' schemes. What started as a civil inheritance dispute had mushroomed into a multi-agency investigation of systematic fraud. By Wednesday morning, the Arizona Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation into Michael's auto repair business practices. The insurance fraud allegations, combined with the evidence of hidden assets revealed during our lawsuit, provided grounds for a comprehensive audit of his business operations dating back 7 years. Rebecca's real estate license was suspended pending investigation by the Arizona Department of Real Estate, effectively ending her career in that industry. But the most immediate impact came from an unexpected source. The IRS, which had apparently been quietly investigating my parents' tax filings for months, accelerated their audit timeline based on the evidence presented in court. Sarah Martinez's forensic analysis of their hidden assets provided a roadmap for federal investigators to examine years of potentially fraudulent tax returns. David's follow-up articles revealed additional victims who had come forward after reading the original story. A former business partner of Michael's contacted the newspaper with documentation showing how my parents had defrauded his construction company out of over $50,000 through fake invoices and phantom work orders. 3 families in their neighborhood reported similar real estate scams where Rebecca had misrepresented property conditions to secure sales commissions. The most devastating revelation came from an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, who had hired Rebecca to sell her deceased husband's home 2 years earlier. Rebecca had convinced Dorothy to accept a below-market offer from a buyer who was secretly Michael's business associate, then purchased the property themselves through a shell company and resold it for a substantial profit. Dorothy had been cheated out of nearly $100,000 through this elaborate scheme. These additional victims provided law enforcement with evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior spanning years. What we had initially documented as financial deception in their lawsuit against me was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise. They had been systematically defrauding people throughout their adult lives, using sophisticated methods to hide their activities and avoid detection. The psychological impact on my parents became evident through increasingly desperate behavior. Thompson, their attorney, withdrew from representing them after they refused to pay his fees and accused him of incompetence. They attempted to represent themselves in filing appeals and additional motions, but their legal documents were so poorly crafted that the court clerk rejected most of them for failure to follow basic procedural requirements. Rebecca began calling local television stations, attempting to tell her version of events and portray herself as the victim of a vindictive daughter and corrupt legal system. Her interviews were disasters that only reinforced public perception of her as delusional and manipulative. In one particularly damaging appearance, she claimed that Grandpa Joe had kidnapped me and that social services had been complicit in covering up the crime. Michael's response was even more destructive. He posted lengthy rants on social media accusing me of elder abuse, claiming I had manipulated Grandpa Joe into changing his will while he was suffering from dementia. These posts were not only false, but legally actionable, providing grounds for additional defamation claims. Henderson advised me that we could pursue these claims later after the criminal investigations were completed. The financial pressure on my parents intensified rapidly. Michael's auto repair business lost its commercial insurance coverage after the fraud allegations became public, forcing him to shut down operations. Without insurance, he could not legally operate the business, and his employees were forced to find other jobs. The 3 franchise locations closed within a week, leaving him with significant lease obligations and no income to meet them. Rebecca's situation was equally dire. The suspension of her real estate license meant immediate termination of all pending transactions, resulting in lawsuits from buyers and sellers who had relied on her services. Her former agency disclosed that they were cooperating with investigators and had discovered additional irregularities in her commission, reporting that suggested she had been stealing from clients for years. The shell company they had used to hide assets was frozen by court order, pending investigation, cutting off access to funds they had been using to maintain their lifestyle. Property records revealed that both their home and rental properties were heavily mortgaged despite their claims of substantial equity, suggesting they had been using the real estate as collateral for undisclosed debts. By Friday of that week, Henderson received a call from a different attorney representing my parents. This lawyer, clearly more competent than Thompson, requested a meeting to discuss potential settlement of our counterclaims. Henderson agreed to listen, but made it clear that any settlement would need to include full disclosure of their assets and cooperation with ongoing criminal investigations. The settlement meeting was surreal. My parents, who had walked into the courthouse 5 days earlier, expecting to claim millions of dollars, now sat across from us, looking defeated and desperate. The new attorney explained that they were prepared to admit fault in filing the frivolous lawsuit and would agree to pay our legal fees and damages, but they wanted assurance that we would not pursue additional civil claims. Henderson's response was firm and non-negotiable. We would accept payment of our legal fees and a formal written apology acknowledging their abandonment of me and the emotional trauma caused by their lawsuit. In return, we would agree not to file additional civil claims related to their harassment and defamation. However, we could not and would not interfere with criminal investigations or other civil cases brought by additional victims. The financial terms of the settlement were modest compared to what they had tried to steal from me, but the symbolic value was enormous. They would be required to publicly acknowledge their abandonment, admit that their lawsuit was frivolous and motivated by greed, and formally apologize for the emotional damage they had caused. The apology would be published in the same newspaper that had exposed their scheme, ensuring that everyone who had read about their actions would also see their admission of guilt. More importantly, the settlement included a permanent restraining order, preventing any future contact with me or members of my chosen family. They were legally prohibited from approaching me, my home, my workplace, or my school. Any violation would result in immediate arrest and prosecution for stalking and harassment. As we finalized the settlement agreement, I realized that my parents' attempt to steal my inheritance had ultimately led to the complete destruction of their own lives. Their greed had exposed years of criminal behavior, destroyed their careers, and left them facing potential federal prosecution. The karma was poetic in its completeness. But for me, the real victory was not their downfall. It was the discovery of who my true family really was and the strength I had found in standing up for myself and honoring Grandpa Joe's memory. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, I stood in the garden behind the house that Grandpa Joe had left me, the same house where he had raised me with such love and care. Maya was helping me plant tomatoes while David documented our chosen family's first harvest from seeds Grandpa Joe had saved years earlier. Mrs. Patterson watched from her yard next door, offering advice and sharing memories of working alongside my grandfather in the same soil. The physical space had been transformed, but more importantly, so had my understanding of what family truly means. The legal battle with my biological parents had forced me to confront painful questions about belonging and loyalty, but the answers had brought unexpected peace. Family is not determined by genetics or legal relationships. It is built through daily acts of love, support, and commitment to each other's well-being. The financial inheritance that my parents had tried to steal had become a foundation for something much more valuable than they could have imagined. With careful management and Henderson's continued guidance, I had used the money not just for my education and security, but to create opportunities for others who had experienced similar abandonment and betrayal. I established a scholarship fund at Portland State University, specifically for students who had aged out of foster care, providing not just financial support, but mentoring and emotional guidance during their transition to independence. The fund was named the Joseph Torres Memorial Scholarship, ensuring that Grandpa Joe's legacy would continue helping abandoned children long after his death. The scholarship program had already supported 12 students in its first year, and each recipient received more than money. They became part of an extended network of chosen family connected to mentors who understood their experiences and could provide guidance during difficult times. Maya had volunteered as a mentor using her social work degree to help students navigate the emotional challenges of building adult lives without traditional family support. David's journalistic coverage of our story had evolved into a broader investigation of inheritance fraud and elder abuse, earning him recognition from the Oregon Press Association and a promotion to senior reporter. His work had exposed similar schemes throughout the Pacific Northwest, leading to multiple arrests and policy changes designed to protect vulnerable families from predatory legal actions. Mrs. Patterson had become something like an adoptive grandmother, joining us for weekly dinners and sharing stories about the neighborhood's history. Her testimony during the legal proceedings had been emotionally difficult, but she later told me that speaking the truth about my abandonment had helped her process her own feelings of helplessness from that terrible week 23 years ago. The criminal investigations of my parents had concluded with plea agreements that sent both of them to federal prison. Michael received 18 months for insurance fraud and tax evasion, while Rebecca got 2 years for real estate fraud and money laundering. The sentences were relatively light, but their careers were permanently destroyed and their financial assets seized to compensate victims. More significantly, their convictions had been widely publicized, making it impossible for them to victimize others in the future. David's continued reporting had created a permanent public record of their schemes, serving as a warning to potential targets and a resource for law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes. The other victims who had come forward during our legal battle had formed their own support network, sharing resources and emotional encouragement as they pursued justice through civil lawsuits. Dorothy Hayes, the elderly woman who had been defrauded during her home sale, had recovered most of her losses through asset seizure and was using her experience to educate other seniors about real estate scams. Perhaps most importantly, the entire experience had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, justice, and the power of truth. When my parents first served me with their lawsuit, I had felt helpless and overwhelmed, questioning whether I deserved the inheritance Grandpa Joe had left me. The legal battle had forced me to understand that I was worthy of love and protection, not because of my bloodline, but because of who I had become through my own choices and efforts. The scholarship recipients often asked me about dealing with family rejection and building confidence after abandonment. I shared with them what I had learned, that the people who choose to be in your life are infinitely more valuable than those who are obligated by genetics or social expectations. Chosen family requires deliberate commitment and ongoing effort, making those relationships stronger and more meaningful than connections based on accident of birth. Henderson had become more than just a lawyer. He was a trusted advisor who continued providing guidance about financial management and legal protection. He helped me establish trusts and protective structures that would prevent future challenges to my inheritance, while ensuring the scholarship fund would continue operating regardless of what happened to me personally. The house itself had been renovated to accommodate the extended family that had grown around me. We had converted Grandpa Joe's workshop into a study space where scholarship recipients could gather for tutoring and mentoring sessions. The dining room had been expanded to accommodate the large family dinners that had become a monthly tradition, bringing together everyone who had supported me during the legal battle. Marcus had moved to Portland after completing his cybersecurity degree, joining our chosen family, and using his technical skills to help other fraud victims document evidence and protect their digital privacy. His expertise had become invaluable to law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes, creating a career path he had never anticipated but found deeply fulfilling. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that my parents' attack had ultimately been a gift, though certainly not one they had intended to give. Their greed had forced me to clearly identify who truly cared about my well-being and who was willing to fight alongside me when I was threatened. It had taught me to value quality over quantity in relationships and to trust my instincts about people's motivations. The experience had also revealed the importance of documentation and preparation when dealing with people who operate in bad faith. Henderson's meticulous record-keeping and our team's thorough investigation had made the difference between victory and defeat. These lessons would serve me well throughout my life, protecting me from future manipulation and helping me assist others facing similar challenges. Standing in that garden surrounded by people who had chosen to love and support me, I understood finally that Grandpa Joe's greatest gift was not the money he had left me. It was the example he had set of what family should be. He had shown me that love is expressed through daily actions, that security comes from building meaningful relationships, and that legacy is created by investing in other people's growth and happiness. Have you ever experienced betrayal from people who were supposed to protect you, only to discover that your real family was waiting in unexpected places? I would love to hear your stories about chosen family and how you found strength during difficult times. Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your words might help someone else who is facing similar challenges right now. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories that prove blood is not always thicker than water. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they deserve love and protection, regardless of their biological family situation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey from abandonment to justice. Remember that your worth is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to treat yourself and the people who truly matter. May you find your chosen family, and may justice always prevail in your own story of overcoming betrayal and building the life you deserve.